Good morning, everyone. A very warm welcome, and I'm so happy to be here. And I'm encouraged that we have a discussion about cultural memory and temporal traces, something that I've been looking at deeply for the last 10 years in the UAE. I want to thank the sponsors and the supporters for bringing this opportunity together, especially in this timely period with global change, climate change, so much going on. It's wonderful to have the opportunity to look back at a project that I started 5 years ago, which was Structures of Memory in the UAE at the Venice Biennale, Architectural Biennale. Before I talk about that exhibition, I would like to provide a context for the curatorial work I did. For that, I'm an art historian, not an architect, and I have been involved in looking at cultural memory and in temporality in architecture and the arts for many years. When I moved to the UAE 10 years ago and I began teaching at York University, I realized that the photographs that I had been studying and reading were, for the most part, taken by non-Emirati cameras, non-Emirati gaze, and I was very interested to find out the other side of the story. Where were the hidden pictures? Where was the invisible part of the cultural traditions that I wasn't seeing? So I asked my students at the time if they would like to embark on a project with me to try to uncover that, because those stories were in their homes, those images were inside their family albums. The context for the Biennale that year was a project that I curated over the span of 10 years called Lest We Forget. And the project was an extended project, an archival attempt to bring together the vernacular stories. So when I put together Structures of Memory in the UAE at the Venice Biennale, I started from a point where I had been collecting family photographs and the vernacular stories of those photographs. And we were looking at family life. So when I was appointed to curate the Biennale, I decided to try to open a conversation between the professionals who built, designed, and conceived of the architectural and urban planning environment with the memories of those people who occupied and moved within that environment. So I brought together a conversation, and it's exciting that today we are at the intersection of conversations that continue. So the collecting that happened in the Biennale started by Rem Koolhaas's brief to look at the past century, to all of the curators of the architectural development with an eye of looking specifically at modernity and how within the globalization of modernity, traces and elements of particular place and experience was still captured and expressed. So making a survey of the architectural and urban landscape in the UAE, and I say we because I work closely with collaborators, Adina Hempel and Marco Sosa, who were my friends and colleagues at York University. And we created an extensive network with our students and with their families, and we began to knock on the doors of architectural firms, to the ministries, to many, many people throughout the country. And they were happy to collaborate, which was wonderful. But at the beginning, the published content either focused on the pre-federal, pre-oil architecture, the vernacular architectural of coral stone masonry and Arish huts, as you see in this photograph by Ronald Kodrai, or contemporary signature architectural structures that were designed by professional architects, built by engineers, and were part of the global idiom. But we were noticing that there was very little research of the first layer of concrete modernist architecture built during the foundation of the Union and built by people who were beginning to come from different parts of the world to Dubai, to Sharjah, to Abu Dhabi, and bringing modernity, which had already passed into a phase of post-modernism in other parts of the world. So these are the buildings that were built in the 70s and 80s that became the primary focus of the Biennale. And I want to point out that this was a time when a lot of these buildings were under threat and still are. For example, the Adnot complex in the center of the screen no longer stands. So we had a sense of urgency not only to record the living memory of the architects and the engineers and the people who were coordinating the building of these structures, but also those who inhabited and occupied those spaces. So we were in the Biennale bringing together primary evidence, both tangible and intangible, so that these would not be lost. And the layering of the cities of Sharjah, Abu Dhabi, and Dubai is very important to the cultural memory and identity of place. We brought together here, I'll show you some examples of slides, urban plans, for example, the John Harris Plan of Dubai, architectural buildings that started the expansion of the urban settings, and also the close work that the architects did with the sheikhs. Here we have Sheikh Rashid. We juxtaposed quotes throughout our work in the exhibition from those who were designing and building the environment with those who experienced. So you'll see the quotes at the top of the slideshow. We talked to many architects, and it's still within living memory, although now many of these people have passed, sadly, but we captured their interviews, and we went into homes and we looked for primary material, most of which had not been published or exhibited before. For example, this briefcase contained this photograph. So here we have Sheikh Zayed working with the grandfather of one of our students, and we brought these photographs to the record, the historical record, where the stories had not been integrated before. And that collecting continues and continues. So here we see not only examples of the built environment architecturally, but also of the urban context. And you can see that there are stories about people who traveled the roads and the memories they have of their excursions. Also, we looked at the influx of people through air travel and their experiences within airports. And we looked at the commercial buildings, such as the souk, that went through several phases of rebuilding, and captured stories such as this of the first public library, which is a place where Sheikh Zayed used to go, and the owner of the library, which is the grandfather of one of my students, he would sit and listen to stories read from the newspaper and from the magazines, and then how that subsequently burnt down and was rebuilt. It is a contemporary form of architecture. We sat with people and asked them about their memories of the interiors of architectural buildings, because there are very few records of that. We do have records of the professional civic buildings, for example, but not of the National House. So we captured many stories of the National House. And here you can see the sort of illustration that we did to capture the way in which the interiors were structured and the experiences that people had within. We also looked closely at the interiors and people's experiences of those spaces. And at that time, we noticed that many of the vernacular photographs showed the intimacy of people with each other in their homes, celebrating the transition into the first national homes. We were able to also notice that people photographed themselves with the accoutrements of modernity, such as the television or the air conditioner. They took pride in photographing themselves in front of their new cars. So with that research in mind, we began to think about how are we going to share this with the public, because it was the first time that items from people's homes or from professional offices were put on public display, and we wanted to make it very conversational and bring the public into that forum. So we decided, as this is going to be a seminal archival project, we wanted to build a seminal archive, but one that reflected the vernacular as well as the early stages of modernity. So this is a sketch of us imagining what that space would look like. We looked at the facades of vernacular architecture, and the idea really was that the stories inside of the Arish home, the stories behind the coral stone walls, were something that were inaccessible. So we wanted to bring that forward. When you drive along the streets of the cities, you notice there are many boundary walls around the National House. From an aerial view, you can see that there are open spaces, which are courtyard spaces, for example. So taking that as an inspiration for how to build our structure, we quoted that and echoed it with the privacy screens and the boundary walls, and produced an exterior that one needed to enter into in order to discover. So the idea was that the visitor would come with us through our process and share that. Entering into this space, we find ourselves inside an archive. an archive that invites people to explore where they want to explore, where their interests may fall. However, it was organized structurally, much like an urban plan, which was a framework for development. So we took Rem's brief, which is to look at the past century of architectural and urban development, and we created a timeline, which you can see at the top here. So the timeline, we started in 1914 and ended in 2014, the century that the Biennale looked at. And you can see that we have buildings here in white. These are the buildings that we wanted to highlight through our research, key buildings that are built here in the UAE, and juxtapose them with the buildings in gray, which are signature and important buildings throughout the world. And below, we put the dates and also critical socio-political economic factors and events that impacted those buildings. So with this orientation, we moved through 4 cases, and we looked in the first case at the vernacular, and then we looked at the discovery of oil and the beginning of the formation of the Federation. And here, the largest section, we focused on modernity and the key buildings of Abu Dhabi, Dubai, and Sharjah, which was our limitation for this phase of the project. And at the last part, the last decades, and the idea of focusing on architects who were looking back through time and trying to capture a sense of environmental sensitivity and cultural identity in their work. So within this structure, we have a series of drawers. The drawers contained primary content, some building materials, family albums, testimonies, architectural plans that people could handle and interact with. And there were quotes on every drawer that provided a verbal testimony that was, again, primary material. So people had the opportunity to explore our findings, and we invited them to contribute to those findings as well. Then, in one other way in which we attempted to organize this complex and prolific amount of material is through a graphic here, figure ground, animated sequence of images that were built for the exhibition by a collaboration of students under Yasser al-Shafari. And here we have from Sharjah, Abu Dhabi, and Dubai, decade by decade, showing the exponential growth and rapid expansion of the cities. And over here we created 4 films, one around the theme of each of these archival cabinets, bringing together architects and people from the communities to discuss the topics that were within each of these containers. So that is the basic structure and the way in which we shared the content. Now, the next year, 2015, we were invited to bring that Biennale back to the UAE, and it was an opportunity for people in the community, and I mean that by plural communities, to come and contribute. At the time, the Cultural Foundation was closed, and there were debates about its restoration, and there were a series of Qasr al-Hosn fort festivals during that time to gauge public interest and to reactivate this space. So in this empty space here, we cleared it and we rebuilt the Biennale. And we also built a studio where architects and people of the communities came and participated with us to continue building the content of the Biennale. Here's an example within the studio. Here is a citizen who shared family photographs, and especially we were interested in traces that had disappeared. So this photograph is a photograph of his family in front of a much-missed volcano that was a piazza in the middle of Abu Dhabi where people would come and share stories. And it's a shared and collective memory that so many people hold on to. And when they talk about these memories, other memories come forward, and there's an invisible layer that's disappeared that people really want to hold on to. And I want to close with this image because the people, when that were living in these cities, were acutely aware of the rapid change that they were experiencing. And their stories are part of what happened. So this initiative is an attempt to capture those stories along with the professional story. And I find over and over that people would be posing in front of their cityscape to show the change and to put themselves inside of it. And this image captures that. Now, at the time of the Biennale, we wanted to share our conversations that we had with people, so we passed out this book. And the book has an in-depth look, or contains an in-depth look of cities, the first section of cities of Abu Dhabi, Dubai, and Sharjah, and it begins with elements. So we look closely at elements of architecture, and then those elements within buildings, and then those buildings within urban landscapes. So the complexity of how the architectural language brings forth ideas of memories from both, again, the architects, the professional side, the vernacular voice is expressed here. And then when we opened the Qasr al-Hosn fort, we published the same thing in Arabic. And last year, I decided to pull together the content that we had developed for the Biennale. Again, it was a seminal research project. We spent about 5 to 6 months developing that content. But after that, continued that work. So this book holds what was inside of those drawers. And the drawers, again, echo our process of looking inside of files and briefcases. So it's all shared here and laid out. And we also replicated in both Arabic and English the timeline that stretched across those cases so that people can contribute to that and understand it. It's an ongoing project. I'm no longer creative director of Lest We Forget, the initiative, but I'm very happily involved in helping to make that transition. My students that I hired at the time are running the project happily, and we continue to collect. So this symposium looks not only at architecture, but of photographs. And I've brought these books because it's, again, all primary material that may be of interest. And the Biennale, of course, was focused on architecture and urban development. However, the Year of Zayed, for example, this is a book that we put together last year. It's many, many stories of people across society. So from children to women to citizens to civil servants, close companions, talking about their experience of the same years that we covered in the Biennale. We're looking very closely at the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. And again, it continues with other projects. For example, an interest in identity. So this book here looks at the temporal traces, which is our subject of this talk. And what we've been doing is we've been archiving tangible and intangible elements of identity. So in this case, people would bring in objects that they consider expressive of their identity and illustrate the intangible, that which you cannot see on the object, memory, with the oral history. So we use artistic language to uncover those traces. Thank you very much.